much of the actual flight lander as we can. Once Insight lands on Mars, it's going to perform a lot of different sequences. One, it's the seismometer. Two is the heat flow probe, and that's where the robotic arm grapple will capture the instrument, lift it up off the deck, and then set it down on the surface. And we only get one shot at many of these sequences, and so we practice here in our sandbox. As a kid, my dad used to take us out to the backyard and show us the stars. And my childhood was a bit rough. I worked in the fields, I was part of a migrant family, and I got to look up to the sky, see the moon, see the stars. And to know that something that I'm working on is actually going to the stars is something that not only inspires me, but I hope inspires an entire generation.
We've all played these claw games before where it can be really frustrating using a grapple to pull a toy out of a machine. Well, the success of NASA's Insight mission depends on a grapple. Let's learn about it on this episode of Crazy Engineering. All right, we are here at the Insight Lander Surface Testbed. He was one of the key engineers on the grapple mechanism. Nick, thanks for joining us. Sure. If we got this grapple, what does it do? What's its purpose?
So its purpose is to grab the instruments so the robotic arm can then lift them and place them down onto the surface.
When I play these arcade games, right, they're really hard to get that toy out of the game. And you're using a mechanism that kind of reminds me of that. Is that a good idea?
So the mechanisms themselves, although they look similar, are very different. With the arcade game, when you grab that stuffed animal and you pull on that stuffed animal, you actually open the claw fingers, that stuffed animal falls out. With the Insight grapple, that mechanism is designed to latch. Once those fingers are closed, it's impossible to pull on those fingers to open it.
So how does it work?
So the grapple has 5 fingers, and we designed this grapple to maximize our success. It uses a wax actuator to open the fingers, grab onto little hooks at the top, and then the robotic arm picks
traveling
those
through
up,
space for more than 6 months
and
and crossing 300 million miles, Insight has reached its destination, the red planet Mars. Welcome to Mission Control at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory on Gay Hill. Less than an hour from now, Insight will begin the most harrowing 6.5 minutes of the entire mission, EDL, descent and landing. The team is as prepared as it can be, but who knows what Mars has in store today. Crew's mission support area is filled with engineers monitoring the situation, and for the during a Mars landing, you can be in the room too. We have a 360-degree camera in this control room, allowing you to experience the landing right along with the team. There you see it. And to look up the link, just go to the Insight page. You see there on the screen.
Thank you so much.
And this mission has actually 2 control rooms. The second is at Lockheed Martin Space outside of Denver, Colorado. Engineers there are on console 2. Plus, people all
I think exploration itself is a great motivator to go places we've never been before and to learn things that we've never learned before. I'm Ingrid Dalbar, and I helped find the best parking spot on the surface of Mars for Insight. This is a really exciting time. Insight is finally on its way to Mars. I feel very honored to be part of this project. I read a lot of science fiction as a kid, so actually going to this place that I read so many books about is really exciting. Normally, we want to go to the most scientifically interesting place that we can safely land. For Insight, an ideal landing location is the most flat, boring place on Mars you can imagine. We have a working group called the Instrument Site Selection Working Group. We have to look at how many rocks are on the surface and how steeply sloped the area is and investigate the physical properties of the soil. All of that is so that when the lander gets on the ground, it's flat and rock-free, and we want the instruments to be able to do the best science they can. Actually dealing with the realities of space exploration is even more exciting than the fictional side of things. And the new science that we're going to get at this is going to change our whole view of Mars and other rocky planets. I'm really excited to be a part of it.
How do you choose a landing site? So you want to study Mars with a lander or rover, but where exactly do you send it?
Libraries and
It's
other
a tricky question for engineers and scientists.
at the
You want it all,
Pasadena
to
Convention
land,
Center,
work, and
that
discover.
is where friends and family
To
are
land
watching
safely
right now.
means no high
There
elevation
will
sites
also
where
be
there isn't
an
enough
opportunity
atmosphere to
watch
slow you down in
New
time.
York City. There they
Try
are,
to avoid
cheering.
places with steep
There will
slopes
be
or
also
big
an
rocks that
opportunity
could
to
damage
watch
something.
New York City when
You
landing
also don't want to sink
gets
into a thick
displayed
layer
on
of
the
dust.
NASDAQ tower you see there
Working
in
is
Times
easier
Square.
near the equator,
And of
where
course,
seasons
if you
aren't
are
so
watching,
extreme and where
please
solar
snap a
panels can get
picture and
lots of
share it
sun.
with us using
And of course,
the
don't send a rover
hashtag
somewhere
Mars
it can't
Landing.
drive.
We'd love to see it. Now
Most
I'd like to
important is what
introduce
you want
you
to
to
discover.
NASA Administrator
Some sites are
Jim
great for studying
Bridenstine.
rock layers.
Thank you for
Others
coming.
might be perfect to listen for
We're
quakes.
so excited to have
Using
you here.
Mars orbiters, you can
So
collect
this is
lots
your
of
first
data on
Mars landing.
potential
It
sites.
is. In this
When you
job,
find the best
now,
spot
Right.
to land,
I
work,
have
and
witnessed
discover,
these as
you found your new
I
home
should say
on
from
Mars.
the sidelines for many years. This is going to be the 8th time that we have a successful landing on Mars. Everybody knock on wood. But this is the first time for me to participate as the administrator. So it's very exciting.
And I spent most of my scientific career studying
Look at the amazing people
internal
here.
heat of planets.
No way I can do
All right, so we hope to have you back on set after landing and maybe take a couple of
This is
social
our
media
experiment,
questions.
Absolutely.
the heat
All
flow
right,
and
if you
physical
would like
properties
to
package.
ask the administrator a question, use the hashtag #NASA. And before you go, you did ask about the Lucky Peanuts. So this is your bottle. Take in there.
Happily munching.
All right, thanks for joining us. Now let's give you some background.
Mars
Insight, in
engine.
short,
Also diese
is short for
internationalen Sommer
Interior
haben wir sehr
Exploration
faszinierend
using
gefunden.
Seismic
Und in
Investigations,
der Tat ist das
Geodesy,
auch,
and
was
Heat
unsere
Transport.
Wissenschaft eigentlich
It's different
auszeichnet.
from other
Aber
Mars
es geht
missions, which all
eigentlich im
study the
Wesentlichen
surface. Insight is
die
the first
Erkenntnis,
mission to
dass
study
wir
the
zusammen einfach mehr erreichen.
Although we've done it before, landing on Mars is hard, and this mission is no different. The process to get from the top of the atmosphere of Mars to the surface we call entry, descent, and landing, or EDL. It takes thousands of steps to go from the top of the atmosphere to the surface, and each one of them has to work perfectly to be a successful mission.
interior of the
The
red
process
planet.
starts well above the top of the
The basic
atmosphere
idea
of
of
Mars.
Insight is
The cruise
to
stage
map out
faces
the
the
deep
sun.
structure of Mars.
It also
we know a lot
has its
about the
radio
surface of Mars.
antenna,
We know
which
a lot about
faces
its
Earth.
atmosphere and
But
even
now
about its
we don't need the cruise
ionosphere. But
stage.
we don't
Its
know very
job
much
is
about
done.
what goes on
The
a mile
next
below
step,
the
just
surface,
7
much less
minutes before
2,000 miles
arriving to
below
the top of
surface
the
down
Mars
to the center.
atmosphere,
And this will be the
is
first.
to separate the cruise stage. Before you hit the top of the atmosphere, though, the space capsule has to orient itself so that the heat shield is precisely facing the atmosphere. Now the fun begins. The vehicle is moving at nearly 13,000 miles an hour, but it's hitting the top of the atmosphere at a very shallow angle, 12 degrees. Any steeper, the vehicle will hit the thicker part of the atmosphere and will melt and burn up. Any shallower, the vehicle will bounce off the atmosphere of Mars. At the very top of the atmosphere, it's about 70 miles above the surface of Mars.
First mission that's
and the
going to
air
Mars
is starting to get
specifically
thicker
to
and
investigate
thicker and thicker.
the
As it
deep
does
inside
that,
of
the
Mars.
temperature of that heat shield gets
We know
well
that
over
the
1,000
Earth is
degrees
habitable.
centigrade,
We know that
enough
Mars
to melt
is not.
steel.
There might
Over
be
the
something
next
that
2
we
minutes,
find
the
out in
vehicle
terms of the
decelerates
structure
at a backbreaking
of Mars
12
versus the
Earth
structure of
Gs,
Earth
from
that maybe
13,000 miles an hour to about 1,000 miles an hour. At about 10 miles above the surface of Mars, a supersonic parachute is launched out of the back of the vehicle. 15 seconds after the parachute inflates, it's time to get rid of the heat shield. 6 pyrotechnic devices fire simultaneously, allowing the heat shield to fall and tumble away from the vehicle, exposing the lander to the surface of Mars. 10 seconds after
Can
the
help
heat
us
shield is
understand
dropped,
why
3
that is.
pyrotechnically
Insight carries a
deployed
seismometer,
legs
which measures the seismic waves that have traveled through Mars from Mars quakes and maps out the deep interior structure of Mars.
We're going to also have a heat flow and physical properties probe, which will penetrate into the Mars surface about 5 meters or 16 feet to take the temperature of Mars.
And it has a radio science experiment which uses the radio on the spacecraft to measure small variations in the wobble of Mars's pole to understand more about the structure and composition of the core.
Insight will be the first mission to pick instruments up off the deck of the lander and place them on the surface of Mars. I like to say that we're playing the claw game on Mars with no joystick. The seismometer needs to be installed in one place and basically not move in order to get the best seismic data.
We also have a wind and thermal shield that will then be placed on top of that seismometer to protect it further from the environment.
For the heat flow probe, HP cubed, it also needs to sit in one place, take a while to hammer itself down into the ground and acquire the thermal measurements over a long period of time.
InSight is a mission to Mars, but it's much, much more than a Mars mission. In some sense, it's like a time machine. It's measuring the structure of Mars that was put in place 4.5 billion years ago, so we can go back and understand the processes that formed Mars just shortly after it was accreted from the solar nebula. By studying Mars, we'll be able to learn more about Earth, Venus, Mercury, even the Moon, even exoplanets around other stars.
Landing on Mars is always difficult. More than half the missions have failed. Our experts in this field are systems engineers for entry, descent, and landing. They speak EDL. Let me introduce you to two in our control room, Christine Soleil, who will be making the mission callouts during landing, and Julie Wirtz-Chen. She is our color commentator who will help explain mission operations. Christine, let's start with you. I understand that there was a final software update and adjustment. What does that mean?
That's right. Yesterday we sent the last EDL software parameter update to the spacecraft's computer. This update told the spacecraft exactly when it will hit the top of the atmosphere and also fine-tuned things like when to deploy the parachute. This EDL software is very important because InSight uses this software to perform entry, descent, and landing completely on its own. Mars is so far away from Earth that when a command is sent from Earth, it takes about 8 minutes for it to reach the spacecraft. Entry, descent, and landing from start to finish is less than 8 minutes long, so InSight has to do this all by itself.
All right, its fate is sealed. Now I understand that the team is about to do a readiness poll. Julie, can you fill us in on that?
Sure, so that's going to be a poll between our EDL communications engineer and several of the different orbiters and antennas that we have here on Earth. So we have Marco listening in on us, and MRO, which is Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, will be listening to our data and recording it for us. And then the radio science engineers will be eavesdropping in on our signal from all the way back here on Earth. And Sandy, our EDL communications engineer, will be checking in with them, making sure that they're all ready to go, ready to support us in just a little, under an hour to land on Mars.
All right, so we're standing by for that readiness poll. And I understand that the peanuts are going to be passed in there pretty soon?
I believe that's the idea, yeah. We'll be passing around the peanuts very soon after that. For those of you who don't know, the JPL peanuts are a tradition that gives us a little bit of extra luck on our critical events. So if anybody out there wants to join in on peanuts and give us some extra good luck peanut vibe, we'd love to have it.
Well, there's a story behind that way back when in the early days of JPL, there were several missions, and there were 6 Ranger missions to the moon that failed.
Yep.
But then with Ranger 7, somebody passed around peanuts.
Yeah, and it worked, and you don't mess with what works. So
absolutely.
It's not a superstition, it's a tradition. We just give ourselves that little bit of extra luck.
All right, so if you have peanuts at home, please have some.
That's right.
All right.
That's right.
Thanks, Julie.
Thanks.
NASA has had 7 successful Mars landings, but the EDL team never, ever becomes overconfident. JPL Chief Engineer Rob Manning says things have to work just right during 6.5 critical minutes.
Although we've done it before, landing on Mars is hard, and this mission is no different. The process to get from the top of the atmosphere of Mars to the surface we call entry, descent, and landing, or EDL. It takes thousands of steps to go from the top of the atmosphere to the surface, and each one of them has to work perfectly to be a successful mission. The process starts well above the top of the atmosphere of Mars. The cruise stage faces the sun. It also has its radio antenna, which faces Earth. But now we don't need the cruise stage. Its job is done. The next step, just 7 minutes before arriving to the top of the Mars atmosphere, is to separate the cruise stage. Before you hit the top of the atmosphere, though, the space capsule has to orient itself so that the heat shield is precisely facing the atmosphere. Now the fun begins. The vehicle is moving at nearly 13,000 miles an hour, but it's hitting the top of the atmosphere at a very shallow angle, 12 degrees. Any steeper, the vehicle will hit the thicker part of the atmosphere and it will melt and burn up. Any shallower, the vehicle will bounce off the atmosphere of Mars. At the very top of the atmosphere, it's about 70 miles above the surface of Mars, and the air is starting to get thicker and thicker and thicker. As it does that, the temperature on that heat shield gets well over 1,000 degrees centigrade, enough to melt steel. Over the next 2 minutes, the vehicle decelerates at a backbreaking 12 Earth Gs, from 13,000 miles an hour to about 1,000 miles an hour. At about 10 miles above the surface of Mars, a supersonic parachute is launched out of the back of the vehicle. 15 seconds after the parachute inflates, it's time to get rid of the heat shield. 6 pyrotechnic devices fire simultaneously, allowing the heat shield to fall and tumble away from the vehicle, exposing the lander to the surface of Mars. 10 seconds after the heat shield is dropped, 3 pyrotechnically deployed legs are released and locked for landing. About a minute later, the landing radar is turned on, sending pulses toward the surface of Mars as the vehicle starts to try to measure how high it is above the surface and how fast it's going. At about a mile above the surface of Mars, the lander falls away from the back shell and lights its engines. And very quickly, the vehicle must rotate out of the way so that the parachute and the back shell doesn't come down to hit it. The last thing that has to happen is that on the moment of contact, the engines have to shut down immediately. If they don't, the vehicle will tip over. So if all the steps of entry, descent, and landing happen perfectly and we are safely on the surface of Mars, we'll be ready to do some exciting new science.
Later on in the program. Meantime, let me introduce you to someone who has been working on Insight for 7 years. He's the project manager, Tom Hoffman. 7 years, and today's the day.
That's right, 7 years, but we're just a little over 40 minutes now, and we're going to be on the surface. It's going to be awesome.
Really exciting
All
stuff.
worth it.
All right, so let's talk about Insight. It's using tried and true technology. It's based on Phoenix. This time, there's a bigger challenge with communication, correct? Normally, we have an orbiter that can give us bent pipe communications, but it's different this time.
That's right. Most of the time when we've landed recently, we've had Mars Odyssey, which can do bent pipe communications, and so we get real-time data as we go through EDL. And we've come to expect that, and actually we really want that.
I like to say that we're playing the claw game
in this case, our
Mars
primary technology, primary orbiter is Mars Reconnaissance
needs
Orbiter.
To be installed
and so
in
what
one
that's going to be
place
doing is
not
actually
move
will
in
be
order
listening
to
us on the UHF. If you go to the video, you can see this. MRO will be listening to us and be getting all the primary data, and it will send it back to us, unfortunately, only at 3 hours after we land.
So it doesn't give us the bent pipe live information.
It doesn't. And we have a couple of other sources that we're looking at. We have a Green Bank Observatory in West Virginia, Max Planck Observatory in Effelsberg, Germany, which will be giving us UHF, but those only give us a couple of different points in time. And so we did something kind of cool this time. We brought along a couple of CubeSats called Marco. And so hopefully they're both working great today.
Oh, fantastic.
So we're hoping that they're going to continue to work all the way through EDL, and they will be giving us real-time feed. So we can show how that works on the next video here.
There they are.
So you can see here's Insight with its crude stage, getting close to Mars. But we have 2 stalkers following us. They've been following us since we launched. They launched on the same launch vehicle as us. And so you can see the green there is we're sending UHF signals to them. And then they turn that around and send a much stronger signal back to Earth. We can't communicate on UHF direct to Earth with a signal that tells what's going on in the spacecraft, but Marco can. If it works for us all the way down to the surface, we're going to have some great information coming from Marcos.
So Marco is basically trying to fill that gap that we would have had if we had live communication coming down to us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So if it does not work, does it affect InSight's mission at all?
No, not at all. We'll just be doing a little more nail biting, but right now it looks like it's gonna be working, but it doesn't impact InSight at all. And we have one final way that we're going to know that we've got successfully to the ground, which is the spacecraft will phone home.
Okay.
Once it gets down to the ground, it'll have gone 7 months through cruise, 7.5 minutes of tear, and it's going to call back and say, hey, I'm on the surface, I'm feeling pretty good, everything looks good so far.
And also to prep the audience, they're not, even after landing, we're not out of the woods just yet, correct?
Not just yet. We have one more step that we have to do. We have to let the dust settle, quite literally. We're going to kick up a lot of dust when we land. We need to let that dust settle before we want to unfurl our solar rays. We're 100% solar powered, so it's very important that we get those out. Unfortunately, both MRO and Marco will be out of view by the time that we have those completely unfurled. And so we're going to have to wait 5.5 hours until Odyssey comes by and tells us that, yes, indeed, our solar arrays are out. So we'll definitely have a celebration when we get successful landing, but we're going to have to temper that just a little bit and wait about 5.5 hours to know absolutely for sure we're in good shape.
So we have immediate knowledge if we have the Marcos. So just to run it through it once again, what's going to happen with EDL? We have the video of the show. How exactly is this all going to play out in 6.5 minutes? And we can roll the video.
Okay. Yeah, so you can see here we're attached to the cruise stage. We drop that off, say thank you for the ride to Mars. It burns up in the atmosphere. You can see it gets very hot on our heat shield. We're getting up in some places maybe 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit as we go through this. We're on the heat shield for about 4 minutes. That dissipates about 90% of the energy that we need to dissipate before we get to the surface. Then we pop our parachute. We're going about 850 miles an hour when we pop the parachute. We're on that for about 2 minutes. Then we'll drop off the heat shield. We'll start acquiring the ground with our radar, very much like an F-16 fighter jet radar. The legs will pop out. We'll start descending. We drop for just a second, which is very terrifying for me. Our descent thrusters, we have 12 of them. They're 68-pound thrusters. Start thrusting and dropping us to the ground. And slowly, slowly, we drop down, going only 5 miles an hour. So in that 6.5 minutes of tear, which is a little less than the 7 minutes, so that's great for me, we go from 12,300 miles an hour at 75 miles above the surface of Mars. We get to the surface, we're at 5.5 miles an hour.
That's amazing. That is absolutely amazing. Well, before you go, Tom, there was a couple of pictures we wanted to show you. We have watch parties taking place all over the country, and let's see if we can put one of these watch parties up for you to see. This is from Ohio. This is a person who has a watch party. It looks like in a classroom.
That is so awesome.
Isn't that great that folks are watching with us?
Yeah, I know people all across the globe are watching this, and we really want to put on a good show for them today.
All right. Well, I'll let you back in the room.
All right, I got to get back in there.
I know you're excited. All right, take care. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, let's introduce you to the people who built InSight, Lockheed Martin Space outside of Denver. These are the folks who built Viking in 1976 and Mars Phoenix in 2008. The operations team is there, and Lockheed InSight EDL manager Tim Lin is standing by. Tim, what's going on in there?
Team's getting really excited. We're just about ready. We're, about a half an hour from entry and the start of entry, descent, and landing. So the team is really excited, focused, but also very excited about the upcoming successful entry, descent, and landing we're getting close to.
Well, we talked about the fact that InSight is based on tried and true technology. It's based on Phoenix, but you've had to make a couple of changes for InSight. What were they?
Yeah, so obviously, as you said, we leveraged Phoenix a lot. There was a lot of great things that we're able to take from the Phoenix mission, but InSight is a unique mission. It's landing towards the equator of Mars, and a number of things are different. Where we're landing, we're about 1.5 kilometers higher in altitude. In addition, and so what that's required us to do is actually come in a little bit more shallow.
In addition, we're a little bit heavier than Phoenix was, so we've had to increase some of the strength of some of the lander itself. So the parachute, we have had to increase the strength. We actually deploy the parachute a little bit higher because of some of the differences in our entry timeline. And because of when we're landing towards the end of dust season, so we also have actually increased the thickness of the heat shield. So we're about a 1/4 inch thicker on our heat shield to accommodate that potential sandblasting that we could see when we actually do our entry, descent, and landing. So a number of things we've changed, but we've obviously leveraged a lot from the very successful Phoenix mission as well.
That's fantastic. So you were able to kind of customize it, because there were some concerns earlier on that there was a dust storm taking place. It was dust storm season.
That's right. In fact, we've had a lot of great support from our orbiting assets, MRO and Odyssey, a couple of spacecraft that we've partnered with JPL and that were built here at Lockheed Martin. They've actually provided a lot of great insight into the weather on Mars, any dust storms that are potentially happening on Mars. And as of today, and actually the last couple of weeks, it's been great on the surface of Mars. We're anticipating a very nominal, very seasonal weather in terms of both density, atmosphere, as well as temperature, and dust storms appear to be very benign, so we're very optimistic it's going to be a great day for landing on the surface of Mars.
All right. That's great news. Thanks, Tim, and I know your team is getting excited over there just as much as we are. Take care.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks a lot. Okay.
The time now is 11:21. It's about 20 minutes. The tension is building in both control rooms. It's about 20 minutes before cruise stage separation. It's not too far off. Cruise stage separation is expected at about 40 minutes past the hour, so we are indeed getting close. So where is InSight going to Mars? It's a place called Elysium Planitia. Planitia is Latin for flat. Elysium is ancient Greek for afterlife paradise. It's located near the equator, north of Gale Crater, not too far from Curiosity rover. The team calls it the biggest parking lot on Mars. It's a place that's safe, got plenty of sunshine, that will power solar instruments to study the interior of Mars.
What's inside Mars? We know a lot about what's inside Earth. But at Mars, we've only just scratched the surface. To learn how Mars formed, we have to study its deep interior. NASA's InSight lander was designed to do just that, by taking the planet's vital signs. Listening for its pulse or seismic activity, including any Marsquakes. Taking its temperature to see how much heat is flowing out from deep inside. And checking its reflexes to see how much the planet wobbles as it whips around the sun. These all provide clues to what the planet is really like inside.
Heat that is flowing
so what's inside Mars?
This temperature
InSight can help us find out by giving Mars its first thorough checkup since it formed 4.5 billion years ago. The more we learn, the better we'll understand all the rocky planets and the history of our solar system.
Joining us now is Bruce Bennett, the principal investigator of Mars InSight. InSight is a mission to Mars, but we keep hearing again and again, it's more than a mission to Mars.
That's right, Gay. I mean, we're going to Mars, obviously, to study the Martian interior and to
although we've done it before, landing on
Mars
is hard, and this mission is no different.
More about the solar system.
The process to get from the top of the atmosphere of Mars to the surface.
And rocky planets, we have an image to show
entry,
folks.
descent,
so
and
we're
landing,
talking
or
about
EDL.
Earth,
It takes
the Moon, Mars.
Venus,
thousands of steps to go from the top of the atmosphere to the surface. And each one of them has to work perfectly
with
to be a successful
dense
mission.
iron core, a rocky mantle, and
the process starts
crust of lighter,
well above the top of the atmosphere
rocks,
of Mars.
But
the cruise stage
details
faces
of
the sun.
Thicknesses of those layers, the sizes, and
it also has its radio antenna,
give
which
us a lot of
faces
clues
Earth.
as to how those
But
planets
now
form
we
and why
don't
they
need
went
the
down
cruise
very
stage.
different
Its
paths
job is done.
The
next step, just 7 minutes
so
before
explain
arriving
to me,
to the top
we
of the
are
Mars
going to have a lander.
is
You're
to
going to be on the
separate the
surface.
cruise stage.
How will you be
Before you
able
hit
to
the top
study
of
the
atmosphere,
interior?
the space capsule
has
has
to use what are called geophysical instruments. They use
to orient itself
the principles
so
of
that the heat
physics
shield
to actually
is
see
precisely
through the rocks.
facing
We're using
the
seismic
atmosphere.
waves
Now the fun
you might
begins.
use a flash
the vehicle is moving at nearly
to take pictures of something.
13,000 miles an hour, but it's hitting the top of the atmosphere at a very shallow angle,
through the
12
planet,
degrees.
And as they go
Any
through the
steeper,
planet, they
the vehicle will hit the thicker part of the atmosphere and will melt
they change
and burn
their
out.
velocity,
Any shallower, the vehicle will bounce off the atmosphere of Mars. At the very top of the atmosphere, it's about 70 miles above the surface of Mars, and the air is starting to get thicker and thicker and thicker. As it does that, the temperature of the heat shield gets well over 1,000 degrees centigrade, enough to melt steel. Over the next 2 minutes, the vehicle decelerates at a backbreaking 12 Earth Gs, from 13,000 miles an hour to about 1,000 miles an hour, at about 10 miles
use on Earth to understand, what the 3D structure is
above the surface of Mars.
So
a supersonic parachute is launched out of the back of the vehicle. 15 seconds after the parachute inflates, it's time to get rid
that information
of
using
the
what?
heat shield.
Well, we had to
6
kind of
pyrotechnic devices fire simultaneously, allowing the heat shield to fall and tumble away from the vehicle, exposing the lander to the surface of Mars. 10 seconds after the heat shield is dropped, 3 pyrotechnically deployed legs are released and locked for landing. About a minute later, the landing radar is turned on, sending pulses toward the surface of Mars as the vehicle starts to try to measure how high it is above the surface and how fast it's going. At about a mile,
those waves keep on going around the planet, and because Mars is not
above the surface of Mars, the spacecraft doesn't come down
and
to hit
finally,
it.
Even
the last thing that has to happen is that on the moment of contact,
and hits us
the engines have to shut down immediately. If they don't, the vehicle will tip over.
We have these surface wave
so
arrivals
all the steps of entry, descent, and landing happen to our lander, and we are safely on the surface of Mars. We'll be ready to do some exciting
by doing that. We can do the same thing that we can do with 3 stations on the Earth, just using the P and the S waves.
And very quickly, there is still another instrument built by DLR that's also being carried up by Insight. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The universe.
Yeah, that's our
My name is Troy Lee Hudson. I am a planetary scientist, and I also design, build, test, and fly instruments to do geology on other planets. Insight is a mission to study Mars as a planet, to look deep inside and understand how Mars, and by extension terrestrial planets, form and evolve.
Strokes, and it gets us down. We hope to get down to be about
This is a full-scale model of the HQ support structure, an instrument to measure the heat coming out of Mars' interior. The mole would come out, hammering itself millimeter by millimeter, and measure subsurface Mars temperatures, thereby telling us about the engine for geologic activity on Mars. I have been fascinated by space, planets, and rocks ever since I can remember. This tattoo is a map of the solar system at the time of my birth. Positions and diameters are to scale, direction to Earth here. I'm interested in the questions that we ask, but also how we answer those questions.
I just love what I do, and I love talking to people about it and getting everyone as excited as I am about the things that are flying in space for the first time.
My name is Anne Marinin, and I fly the first interplanetary mission that will
he was a graduate student.
In your
backpack.
I am officially a systems engineer at JPL and on the Marco mission. Marco is the first interplanetary mission. These kind of satellites
going to be like
as we get small satellites about the size of a family-sized cereal box. We have a little pocket-sized model of Marco. It's a great visual tool for the team to use and understand what's happening with the spacecraft.
17 different missions to the surface of
With
Mars.
Insight, one of the things we hope to demonstrate with Marco is communications relay capability that we're working on verifying. And if we can demonstrate this, it has huge implications for other missions landing on Mars or other planets. We're optimistic
The target location is about 12 kilometers in size.
It is
Our
a technology
accuracy is comparable to shooting a
There's still
basket from Staples Center in downtown LA and hitting nothing but net in a basketball hoop in New York City that is moving at a speed of about 2 feet per second and is spinning about its axis.
The landing site, we have an ellipse that's pretty big. It's about 60 miles long. We could land anywhere in that ellipse. There's a chance that we could land right on a rock. And we don't really have any control over that, so that's what makes me nervous.
We've tested the radar by flying it on a helicopter. We've tested pieces of the heat shield by putting them in an arc-jet facility. Tested the parachute by testing it in a wind tunnel, and putting all that together in a very tightly controlled sequence where every single thing has to go right. We've never tested that, and the first time it's going to happen is once you deliver us to Mars.
To go on space to participate with the rest of humankind to the exploration of the
11:29 a.m. Pacific, and you're watching live coverage of the InSight landing from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. We are about